This episode, we want to make sure our listeners know about an upcoming event here at the UC College of Law. We will be hosting the 34th Annual Corporate Law Symposium on March 7th, 2025. The topic is the Supreme Court's continuing program to thwart federal agencies, and more importantly, the impact of that program on business. We have assembled an amazing slate of speakers and panelists, including leading academics like Professor Lisa Heinzerling of Georgetown, in-house counsel such as Susan Whaley of Procter & Gamble, Steve Ewald of MedPace, and Matt Miner of Walmart, and practitioners like David Lavin of Dinsmore & Scholl, Beth Naylor of Frost Brown & Todd, and Keith Bradley of Squire Patton Boggs. We will put registration links in the show notes, and we hope you're able to join us on the day. Now to this week's episode. Kasey Ingram reached out to congratulate me on my appointment as director of the Corporate Law Center, as he is also a Cincinnati law graduate and a former corporate law fellow in the center. We started a correspondence that led me soon after to invite him to join the podcast. He may be the only guest we will ever have with experience in a nuclear submarine, and we talked about how that experience helped shape his legal career, the importance of seeing opportunities as a young lawyer and seizing on them, and practical strategies for developing a global compliance program, among many other topics. First-year law student Josie Holtzberry joined me for this wide-ranging conversation with Kasey. We hope you enjoy listening. Our guest today is Kasey Ingram. Welcome to the podcast, Kasey.
Oh, happy to be here.
So before we get into what you're doing now, I just kind of want to go back to your education because I think you certainly have a different background than anyone else that's been on the podcast before. You graduated from the Naval Academy in 1994, is that right?
That's correct. Just had my 30th year reunion a couple of weeks ago.
So how did attending a service academy and then you did your 5 years after that, am I right that it was a nuclear submarine?
That is correct, yes.
How did that influence your approach to law school, if it did?
Well, law school was the most free I had been for 9 years. It was the first time in 9 years where I got to decide when I woke up, when I went to bed, and when I ate. So that was kind of nice. At the Naval Academy, everybody has to take naval law. So that was where I got my first exposure to it. And I really enjoyed it. And it just seemed to click. And then I was on the honor committee. And I don't know how much you know about Naval Academy history, but the class of 94 is the one that had the huge electrical engineering scandal. And there were roughly 30 students that were found guilty of cheating. And I was part of the honor committee that had to deal with that investigation and then fix the program afterwards. And it was a great experience because at some point you're acting as a prosecutor, at some point you were acting as a defense attorney, and you were doing lots of investigations and trying to figure out how do you create a process that is fair to everyone but still reaches the truth. And then when I went out into the fleet, so to become a submarine officer, you spend about a year and a half studying nuclear engineering, and then you go out to your sub for around 3.5 years. And there are no investigators or lawyers or police on a submarine. So if anything comes up, say somebody complains of harassment or there's an issue, the officers get assigned to investigate. So I did several investigations on the sub, small things, mostly HR type issues, just as you get in any workplace. And also as a division officer, you have about 25 guys that report to you, and most of them are under 25, and they have their own set of issues. So you get to go to the divorce lawyer with them. You get to go to the family services center with them. You get exposure to a lot of areas of the law. And I enjoyed it. And I thought, well, I'll give it a try when I get out. Fortunately, University of Cincinnati, I was able to get the scholarship and the corporate law fellowship. So it was sort of a financial low risk situation. And it was a perfect fit. A lot of the mindset on a submarine, especially when you're dealing with nuclear weapons and nuclear reactors, if you want to do something, you need to be able to prove why you want to do it. So here's where I want to go. Here are the rules that apply to that. Here are the processes and procedures, and here's how I'm going to get there. And that same mindset applies a lot to the law.
So you've definitely carried it through then into your practice, what you learned in the submarine.
Being a submariner has probably opened more doors for me than anything else.
Interesting. Josie?
Yeah, so moving on to your UC law career, you had a really decorated career those 3 years for being in the Order of the Coif Law Review and Corporate Law Fellow. So I was wondering what stands out the most to you from your 3 years here at UC Law.
Probably the friendships that I made. I still have people from the time there that I keep in contact with. We had a great corporate law fellowship team. There were three of us. Uh, One is a corporate law partner in Cincinnati. The other one is in-house counsel at Procter and Gamble. He also was an academy grad from the Air Force Academy. Still keep in touch with the corporate law director, and it was just a great way to focus on what I wanted to study. Another area I was involved with, which was not on my resume, but was what we called at that time SLEC, or the Student Legal Education Committee. And we got to help interview prospective faculty. And it was a great experience just to get to know the faculty there, spend time with them, see what they looked for in faculty, the background of how law school worked. It provided a lot of understanding of why we did what we did, what were the costs behind it, sort of the running the business of a law school.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing to pick up on. And then also, do you have any advice for a like modern law school student or the law students of today?
It was good for me to have had a break between undergrad and going to law school. And I know not everybody can do that and it doesn't work, but there's a lot of advantages I received in my legal career because I had worked before. Um, and we'll get into some of that when we talk about my career at Jones Day and other things. But that extra work experience where you learn how to operate in a working environment, the soft skills of being in a business or leading people, that maturity got me advantages and moved my career faster than people who did not have that to fall back on. And it doesn't necessarily mean I was a better student or more mature, but because I had something to point to, it opened doors that weren't opened otherwise.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, and I wasn't doing anything. I was selling windows and doors for a couple of years, which is maybe slightly less important to the country than running a nuclear submarine. But it did give me the mindset coming into law school that I was able to treat it like a job. You know, that the
Yeah.
difference between undergrad and law school is huge, but the difference between working a job every day and law school, it's different, but it's doable. It's reachable.
And
I,
just that,
I go,
yes.
sorry. I asked you a very long yes no question.
No, I would agree. I personally did go straight from my undergrad, but my friends who did take years off, I like really value their experience, what they've learned. They have really interesting stories.
Did
The
you want to talk
one
about the
thing
French?
while
Go
you're
ahead.
at school is I spent a lot of time taking advantage of the faculty. So the professors that I had, if I didn't understand something or if I wanted to know it better, I went and saw them, and I saw them all the time. And a lot of that's a throwback to the Naval Academy where you were required to go get extra instruction if you didn't understand something. So I took that same mindset to law school, and I was surprised how many other students did not take that time to take advantage of the faculty. I mean, they're there because they want to teach.
Yeah, there were times when we both were in the same building. We have a beautiful new building with lots of windows now. But in the old building, the fourth floor, I was up there quite a lot, but I didn't see a lot of other students up there. And I don't know if it was the same when you were there.
The exact same, yes.
You were going to ask about his clerkship
Yeah,
experience.
definitely.
Okay.
So then you did go on to have a clerkship in Delaware for Chancellor Chandler, and I was wondering how you came about this opportunity.
It came about because of the corporate law fellowship. So at the time, the director of the corporate law center had a connection with the Court of Chancery, and he invited Chancellor Chandler to come and speak at we would have these day-long events each year. And so Chancellor Chandler came and gave the lunch presentation, and I got to meet him and thought, this is interesting. I'm going to apply for a clerkship. So I applied with him and all the other vice chancellors as well. And I got interviews. And I think one of the main reasons I got an interview is because they knew about the Corporate Law Center and said, okay, they have a base understanding of what we do. Um, and it was a great experience to go and interview because Chancellor Chandler was in Southern Delaware. And then I went to Wilmington, Delaware to interview with all the vice chancellors. And it's a very collegial court. Everyone gets along. It's friendly. There's a lot of joking. Uh, the group, because there's only, at that time anyways, I don't think it's changed. They had one chancellor and four vice chancellors. So you have a lot of different people that work for them, but it's a very small bench. They also, I interviewed with the Delaware Supreme Court at the same time, and it was one of the justices on the Delaware Supreme Court had been a vice chancellor. And he just looked at me and said, "Why would you want to clerk on this court if you could clerk on the Court of Chancery?" And I heard that and I said, okay, that's some pretty good advice. And fortunately, Chancellor Chandler made me the offer and I accepted it immediately. And I will share with anyone who's a law student and hears this, the judge will say to you, please take time and think about it. Don't. If they make you an offer and you're at all interested, accept it on the spot. That because I learned later that judges remember those who wait and they don't remember them fondly. It is better if you are interested at all, you get the offer, you take it. And it worked out.
It's great advice. So we'll talk later about what you're doing now. But, like me, and I'm surprised at how many in-house counsel this is true of. You started as a commercial litigator.
Correct.
I was at Lewis and Roque in Phoenix. You started at Jones Day, correct?
Correct. Yes.
So what was the upside and were there downsides of working in a litigation capacity in a large law firm?
Well, the number one upside of going to a large law firm is the pay is outstanding.
Yeah.
And they do give clerkship bonuses, so you get brought in. And the downside is the reason the pay is outstanding is because the work is immense. And it was a lot of trial by fire, drinking from a fire hose, all those cliches. What I loved about it was coming in, and this is where my previous experience mattered. There were a lot of cases that people just didn't want to deal with because they weren't interesting. So tax litigation is where I sort of cut my teeth. No one wanted to do state tax litigation. They're like, that's kind of boring and dull. And I said, I'll do it. And so my first deposition that I ever saw, I was taking by myself because it was a sort of a low value, low dollar state tax litigation in Columbus, Ohio. And I said, I'll handle it. And they just gave it to me because no one else wanted to work on it. It wasn't one of the big class actions. It wasn't a sexy type of litigation. And I got to do 3 different trials related to state tax litigation. And then from that experience, I got involved in bankruptcy litigation, which again is a lot of motion practice. Most people don't want to do it because they're like, oh, it's a difficult area to understand. But if you take the time and you talk to the experts, you can figure it out. And you get a lot of court time from that. And that's not typical in big law. But if you're willing to take the risk and sort of talk to people and do things that aren't popular, you get a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, at one point I accidentally became the firm's litigation associate expert on ERISA matters, which, who would have ever thought? But, it ended up serving me well later in my career because you end up having to really dig into, statutes and regulations. You can't just, it's not I don't want to denigrate the people in the tort section, but it's not a red car, blue car case. What's happening in the state tax regs or, in ERISA litigation. At some point when you were at Jones Day, you were seconded to Scott's, and as both in-house and outside at the same time. How did that work out?
So on a Friday afternoon, I was at a CLE and I get a call from this partner saying, I need you to go out to a client for 2 days. They need you to look at some documents. And I said, okay, I'll be out there on Monday. I was there for a year. Scott's had gotten into some issues with the Environmental Protection Agency. So as part of lawn and garden, you make pesticides. Pesticides are managed by the EPA, and there's certain registration requirements. And I can share what's public knowledge at this point, but unbeknownst to Scott's, one of their registration professionals had determined it was much quicker to put false signatures on documents than wait for the EPA to actually sign them. And so they had some products that had false signatures on it. And the person who supposedly signed it at EPA is like, I never signed that, which led to a long investigation, then a long audit. And so what was supposed to be a 2-day event, I was going out there every day for 10, 12 hours a day. And it was wonderful. I had a great time because you're right in the thick of it. It's high stress. Everyone wants to get to the right thing. And they were livid about how they'd been betrayed by one of their colleagues. And so this whole push of, we had a problem, we need to fix the problem, how do we make it better? We'd have 7 a.m. meetings, everybody in a room, figure out the plan for the day and move forward. And just the collegiality behind that and knowing you were trying to make something better, it was a great experience.
And getting the opportunity to be fully focused on one client full time must have been rewarding, more so than the kind of bouncing around that you can do as a corporate litigation associate.
Exactly. And that's sort of what pushed me to want to go in-house, because you're out there before things become a problem. And the more you know and the more you're involved, the more you can stop something before it gets to the point you need a corporate litigation associate.
So when you made that decision, I mean, I think you anticipated my next question about how did you make the decision. It was quite a lot based on the positive experience you'd had on the secondment, right?
Yeah. Nothing ever happens that direct. So I was out there for a year, and then I got a call from a very good friend of mine asking if I'd join her at Dinsmore and Shoal to do bankruptcy work, bankruptcy litigation. And so I took that opportunity and went over there and worked with a great group of people, but I started to get calls from headhunters about in-house positions. And I just loved being in-house. So I called up the general counsel of Scott's and said, yeah, I'm looking at in-house stuff. If you ever have something open, let me know. And he called back and said, yeah, would you like to be director of litigation? You can start next month. And that's how it came about.
So I mean, you knew something about the company, but when you've actually made the change, how did what you expected it to be compare with what it turned out to be? And I don't mean like there's any, bait and switch or anything like that, but just it is different when you are there every day. You've put your outside counsel badge away and you're now part of the team. How was it different for you, or was it exactly what you expected?
There were some differences. So I went from having a nice big partner office and covered parking to having to walk a half mile in February to get to the office to sit in a cubicle. Going from a profit center to a cost center is a big difference. That was probably the only, I would even say, negative. One of the major positives is I did not have to write down my time at all. I just did what I had to do when I had to do it. There were a lot more meetings. Everything in a big corporation like that is done by meeting. It took a while to get used to your day as a meeting, and then you figure out your work later. The expectation that was somewhat similar to what I'd experienced being seconded out there. And a lot of the difference there is how much, when you're in a law firm, everybody you're talking to understands the law, and you deal with your clients. Everybody understands the law. You get out into the business and it's a foreign language. Some of the things that we take as just basic understanding, they've never experienced or understood. So you have to sort of step back and say, okay, what you're saying makes perfect sense, but here's the framework we have to review it under. Here's the standard we have to meet. And so we can get where you want to go. We just can't get there going the direction you want to head.
The yes, but. Yes, exactly. I understand what you're trying to accomplish, but we're going to have to do it in this way, not the direction you're headed. Yeah, I mean, I had very similar experience in that meetings for sure. You would go to a staff meeting and you'd be sitting there going, is this a valuable use of my time? Maybe I should be back in my office doing the work that needs to go out. And then something comes up and you're like, wow, thank goodness I was here. So how did you learn how to interact with the business. I mean, I think the way you put it, I often refer to what I did as the translator role.
Okay.
I was trying to translate to the business in language they would understand what the legal constraints were. And I was also serving the same role with outside counsel, trying to translate to them what our business was about and what we cared about. Um, but to do that, I felt like you had to really gain a complete understanding of the business. How did you learn the business more than you knew it from your time there on what sounded like a discrete project?
So the nice thing about the way Scotch was laid out is they had a lot of empty cubicles. And so instead of sitting in my cubicle working, I would go, the major clients I had, I would go over and spend time sitting in an open cubicle and doing my work there because I had a laptop and I had a notebook so I could work any spot. And sitting in that group, you overhear a lot. And people come over and ask a lot more questions when they don't have to walk to the other end of the building to see what's going on. So putting myself, sort of immersing myself in the business, you become familiar, people get to know who you are, they start asking more questions. I can go ask them questions. This doesn't make sense. How does it work? Uh, you hear conversations and you sort of step in. Sorry to interrupt, but what you just said, we can't really do that. Or you might have an issue here. And you become a trusted advisor because people know who you are. You're not the stranger sitting at the end of the hall that says no all the time.
When you're dealing with as the director of litigation, you're often looking almost exclusively, at least at times, and dealing with things that have already happened and not, I felt like I was driving a car staring out the rearview mirror, not having any idea where the business was going because I had all these litigated matters that started before I got there. How was your experience in that? Did you have a similar experience? How did you overcome that impediment of you feel like you're fighting last year's battles while the business is moving forward?
So the hardest part about that to me was pointing out mistakes that had been made without making the people who made those mistakes feel like I was attacking them. Because in business, you can make bad decisions, but they don't seem like a bad decision when you made them. So it's trying to explain, okay, I understand why you did this. Explain this to me again. Well, now this is what happened. And so we're sort of stuck. You signed this contract saying you were going to pay them this amount of money for the product for the next 5 years, and then the market collapsed. I don't say you probably shouldn't have signed a contract for a commodity with a 5-year term. You have to step in and say, okay, well, what did we discuss with them? Is there any way to renegotiate this? What are the non-litigational ways around it first? And then after that, it's just building the best case you can.
And exploring the non-litigation ways to accomplish something, often you'd get from the client, just go get my money. You know, how did you react to that? I assume it happened, right?
It happened all the time.
Yeah.
And sometimes, just like any time you're dealing with multiple emotions and multiple people, what you think is going to happen isn't what happens, or the stance that you're taking may not, it's going to be diametrically opposed to what the other side thinks. So you have an issue and you say, this should easily settle for this reason, and we're being completely fair in what we're doing, and the other side just doesn't see it that way. And trying to explain to your client, okay, I understand that this is our patent. As an example of a patent infringement case, and somebody sued saying you infringed the patent, and it was clear we were going to win. And I understand we're going to win, but let's step back and say, we're going to win and be out $1 million. Is there any way we can resolve this for less? Because you're giving me a budget, you want this resolved for $100,000, but you don't want to settle. So you can't go to court for $100,000 ever.
You then you joined after Scott's. You went to ICL for a period of time, and that I guess opened the world of the rest of the world and not being focused on U.S. matters entirely. Did I get that right?
Yes. So when I was at Scott's, my last year or so, I'd switched from litigation into compliance.
Okay.
And as part of resolving the EPA issues, we built a pesticide compliance program for them. And then Scott sold off its commercial side of the business to Israel Chemicals. And I didn't go with the sale when it happened, but a few months later, I went over and joined Israel Chemicals to handle their compliance program. And they had gotten in trouble in Israel completely inadvertently. They had sold a ship in another subsidiary to a company that was partly owned by the Iranians, and they had no clue, and they got in trouble. And so they needed somebody to come and figure out, how do we prevent this ever happening again? So I was given the task of building an anti-corruption, anti-money laundering, and anti-boycott program on 6 different continents. Had 9 months to do it. And it was a great experience. It was exhausting. I was on the road 3 weeks a month for 9 months. But dealing with Israelis, Germans, Dutch, Brazilians, Indians, Chinese, Japanese, you dealt with all of them to get to the same point. And each one of them had a different ERP system. You know, some had SAP, some didn't. How do you then coordinate it into that IT system? So I had to start big picture. Here's where we want to go. How are we going to get there? Here's the steps. How do we then implement the steps to your business? And it was a lot of understanding, how do you operate? And then how do I implement this program in your operation so it is no extra work for you to comply?
I rolled out a global compliance program, but it took me 3 years, not 9 months. So I don't know how you did it in 9 months, but I guess maybe the 3 weeks on the road every month might have had something to do with it. I think, with the compliance programs and building them, you have to overcome the natural reticence of, this is somebody that I can trust to help me build something that's going to help us get better, and not just someone that's coming to nitpick the way I do things and give me a whole bunch of rules that are going to make my life harder. How did you deal with that aspect of it?
I always said there's about 4 conversations you have to have. And the first conversation is you sit down with the business and say, we need to do this. And then you let them vent for about an hour, telling them how you're going to ruin their business. You're going to put them out of work. You're going to cost them too much money. They're never going to happen. You don't know what you're doing. And you just let them vent and then leave. Then you go back the second time and you say, okay, I understand we have some concerns. Here's where we need to go. What do you actually do so we can figure that out first? And then you get the explanation. Then you go back the third time and you say, here's how I want to integrate in your operations. And then they tell you all the reasons that won't work. And you listen to that and make the changes you can make, and then go back a fourth time. And usually by that time you can get, okay, we're going down the same page. But it's taken the effort to have those 4 conversations and be patient enough to get to the fourth, because the first 2 or 3, nothing good is going to happen.
It's interesting that you developed that understanding, because where I've seen people fail trying to put in compliance programs is in reaction to conversation 1, the venting about, you don't understand, we actually have to sell things here. Our competitors are not going to do the same thing that you want us to do, and therefore you're going to put me at a disadvantage. I'm going to be out of business, and all of our children are going to starve, and then. The first reaction is often to escalate, instead of to stand back and say, okay, they need to I need to give them time to let this season, instead of going straight to the GC and saying, I talked to Josie, she doesn't want to do the compliance program. You need to tell them to listen to me. And I think that's something that, young lawyers need to understand, is you have to build those relationships. You don't get a badge and a gun, and an opportunity, therefore, to impose policies on the business.
And my experience is most people want to do the right thing because they don't want to get in trouble. But they have key performance indicators they have to meet. They have sales they have to meet. They don't want to lose their job. So you've got to address the fear first. And then once you get over the fear, you explain how what I'm going to do is actually going to make it better for you, because I'm going to make sure you don't get in trouble and you don't have to call me every 5 minutes to ask if you can do something. But you're right. You've got to allow some of that stuff to just roll off your back initially, and that's where a lot of the Navy experience comes in because you get used to getting yelled at first. So you just stand there and take the yelling and the abuse, and then later you go do the job.
And then from there, you joined ISK Americas, where you still are. Could you talk about what the company is and what it does? I think one of the things that I always find fascinating is how many big companies there are out there that no one's ever heard of because they're B2B or they're operating under a name that we all know, but the company isn't actually called that. So could you just talk a little bit about what the company is and what it does?
Certainly. So if you go back to when I was at Scott's, they were consumer sales of lawn and garden products. So pesticides, fertilizers. And then when I went to Israel Chemicals, it was B2B of agricultural chemicals, pesticides, and fertilizers. And while I was there, a contact I had made in the outside counsel world called up and said, there's a company in Ohio looking for a general counsel with pesticide experience, and you're really the only one I know. Are you interested? And I said, I'll talk to anybody. So I talked to him, and that's how I ended up getting the position. And it's one step back in the food chain in that ISK invents the proprietary chemicals. So ISK has three major functions. It's headquartered in Osaka, Japan. A third of the business is inorganic coatings. So it's mostly titanium dioxide and the type of molecules that you would put in printer toner, car paint, house paint, just anything that you would put a coating on. The second area is agricultural chemicals, which is fungicides, herbicides, insecticides that are used for large-scale agriculture. There's some lawn and garden, but it's all invention. We don't distribute any of it. We make it, sell it to distributors. Then the third area is relatively new. It's healthcare, and it is a mixture of animal health and human health products. And so that is something we're actually developing here in the United States now, which is a whole different aspect of my job. But it all goes back to their core function as R&D, and ISK has a huge R&D facility in Japan, and all they do is invent new chemicals and figure out what they can do. And if there's a way to commercialize it, they commercialize it. They outsource the sales, marketing, everything to other companies. So it's all at the invention phase.
Very interesting. So as you mentioned, they're headquartered in Osaka. What are the challenges, whether they're cultural, legal, to having an HQ that is in a very different culture under a very different legal system? And how have you overcome those?
So the Japanese culture does not understand the U.S. litigation system. I found it interesting in Japan, they have as many new lawyers every year as we have in the state of Ohio. So Japan has 10 times the population of the state of Ohio, but it gets the same number of lawyers. So if you think about that, the concept of litigation and legal practice is just not as big over there. There's a lot more cooperation, a lot more let's reach a settlement. The adversarial nature of our system is just not as common. So that sort of changes your approach on how you address issues over here. And that I have to explain, okay, I know we don't want to be adversarial, but if we are going to survive in this market, we have to take an approach that is more adversarial so we can get to the right position. So there's a lot of explanation behind that. The litigation cost, trying to explain it, takes a little more time. And it all goes back to being patient. You got to take the time to explain it, let people absorb it. Something that in the US you may be able to say, and everybody has the same baseline understanding, and you can resolve it in one meeting, may take a few months because you've got to educate first. And the great thing about it is there's such an openness to understanding and to reaching the right decision that I've never had a position or a situation where I felt we've done the wrong thing, but I've never had anything that's happened fast.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to visit Japan years ago when my daughter was working there for a summer, and it was it was not on the list of, I've been all over the world, and it was not on the list of places I really wanted to visit. And I've never been more surprised at just how welcoming, you couldn't have a more polite place to do business, you know? And that sounds like it's a stereotype, but I mean, it is definitely a difference in the culture, where you're on a train and somebody accidentally bumps into you. In London, that was the expectation. In Japan, the person would apologize to you. It was just so different. I couldn't. It took me a while to get used to it, in a couple of weeks, and then I've always wanted to go back. So, do you get to travel there quite often?
I go about 3 or 4 times a year,
Good.
and it's amazing. It's perfectly clean. Doesn't matter the season. Everything is always clean. And you're right. You walk down the street, you don't get jostled. Everyone waits for the light to change before crossing the street. It's completely different.
Yeah. So you talked about explaining how litigation works to your clients, and then you have to then turn and work with outside counsel, because all of this work you're doing, I dare say, you can't do by yourself. Um, Working with outside counsel, how did your time in private practice influence how you work with outside counsel, or did it?
Definitely helps when you're reviewing bills because you have an understanding of what certain things mean, and you can say, okay, this associate who spent 17 hours and all it says is reviewing documents, you might have a little bit of padding going on there. You might want to look into that. Um, doesn't mean it always happens, but there's certain triggers that you see just based on the experience of being on the other side.
Yeah, I'd always say things to the partners like, I'm not accusing them of padding, but I am accusing them of not adding this much value. You know,
That's a good way to say it. I may steal that.
yeah, I'll license it to you.
Okay.
Have you become more or less deferential to the expertise of outside counsel as you've gone on? I found that I was extremely empathetic to outside counsel when I had just been one a few weeks before, and 10 years on, I was like, just get on with it.
So I've found with outside counsel is I use them more as a second check, unless it's litigation, which is completely different.
Right.
Uh, but we try to get as far as we can on our own and then send it to them to say, okay, find the holes. What am I missing? What are we saying wrong? What can't we do? And viewing them like that as a second check, as once, it saves a lot of money. But at the same point, it creates almost a partnership because I found a lot of lawyers like that better. They really don't want to do the grunt work if they don't have to of drafting the contract from scratch. But if they can tell you, here's the holes you need to fix, or here's the area you need to address, they're a lot quicker to answer your phone.
You talked earlier, I want to, sorry to go backwards, but you were talking about what your ISK does, and it sounded to a telecoms infrastructure lawyer to be very complex stuff. Is your, I don't remember what it was that you studied at the Naval Academy. It must have been something technical if it put you on a nuclear submarine.
So everyone at the Naval Academy basically graduates with a Bachelor of Science in with an engineering emphasis. But I had a political science major. Probably the only political science program where you take electrical engineering, statics, dynamics, thermodynamics, calculus 3, and then in submarines you go through and you basically get a master's level in nuclear engineering. So there's a lot of technical knowledge there, which has come in handy, but I don't understand all the science of some of the chemistry of what we do, but I know enough that I can keep up.
Okay. And would you encourage people that have a science background to pursue the law? Do you
Oh,
think that's
definitely.
a,
There's a
all
lot
right?
of overlap between the scientific method and the legal method, in that you check on something, you see if it's right, you check again, you try to keep reaching to the right point. The difference is in the scientific method, there's usually a black or white answer, and there is only a gray answer on the legal side. But the process is similar.
All right, I'm going to clip this part and send it to my daughter, the physicist, who I've never been able to convince to go to law school. Um, Going back to outside counsel, how has managing outside counsel changed over time in the time you've been doing it?
It's the big change, it seems like, is since the pandemic, um, because the fewer people are in the office. And so there seems to be less large teams and more of an individual focus coming from the outside counsel. And I found it surprising talking to like senior partners that I've known about how few associates come into the office to do the work. And so there's almost less feeding down to associates because they're not there and the partners aren't used to farming it out to them electronically.
How do you think they'll get past that? Or do we have to just drag everybody back into the office somehow, kicking and screaming?
So my personal opinion, and it's probably not popular, but if you want to get ahead, you need to be there. Because I got more cases as a junior lawyer and I got more experience by being the person down the hall that could jump up and do it. And so even when I didn't have a lot of work, I was there because that's where the work comes from. And it's the same thing in a business. I give this example when I started here at ISK. We have a plant in Memphis, Tennessee, and I was trying to figure out how the plant worked. And so for a year, I went down every single month for a week and just sat in the plant and watched how it operated. And I got to know a lot of people. And it's amazing how many things that people had to complain about that needed to be fixed and they'd never said anything. And it took them 9 months of seeing me before they felt comfortable enough to come up and say, hey, this has been going on and I don't really like it. Can you fix it? And they were significant issues that needed to be addressed. But it only happened because I was there. And did I like flying to Memphis? Not really. Did I like being away from home? Not really. But it's the only way I ever achieved that.
Yeah, I remember the difference between when I was occasionally going to Europe as the global chief ethics and compliance officer, and when I went to Europe to become the head of the legal department there. It felt like there was an obligation of everyone just to make sure I got back on the plane when I was the visitor. And then when I was just there and they had to deal with me, we were able to develop relationships and fix some of the things that I'd been trying to address, but couldn't really get in the door with. And I think, you can't really overstate the value of just spending time with your clients, understanding what they do and building that trusting relationship that doesn't happen from slogans and posters.
And it opens a lot of doors as well. So I mentioned our healthcare business that we're starting up. So I started out doing the legal work for the animal health business and the life sciences business. And then my boss retired and he had been running those two businesses. And because I'd gone to every meeting and had been to every event and knew all the players, they made me president of those two subsidiaries, which changed. You talk about outside counsel, that changed a lot of the focus as well, because I am no longer the day-to-day lawyer for those subsidiaries. I rely on outside counsel. So I have a great outside counsel who does most of that work for me and is a specialist in that area because I've moved into a business role for those businesses. But it wouldn't have happened except for the fact that I was always around.
How did you approach the idea of going into actually managing a business? Is it something you actively pursued, or is it sounds like it kind of happened a bit organically because they needed somebody that knew what was happening and you were the one that knew?
Yes, it wasn't an intentional plan. It literally, I got a call and the person who runs the business in Japan said, I wondered if you'd be willing to take these over when your boss retires. And I said yes, because it seemed like a great opportunity. And I had followed him enough to know the big picture of what to do. And we have such a great support system here. They sent over a young man from Japan who has been here in the U.S. as sort of the interface. And he knows that he's a pharmacist by training, knows the business cold. And having him as a backup, I knew I had all the support that I needed. So it was worth the risk.
my standard question here is, do you have any experience managing or leading teams before you took on that role? Which seems like kind of a dumb question to ask somebody that was an officer on a nuclear submarine. So pretend I didn't put that forward as the question, but I guess how did your experiences working with non-lawyers affect your ability to take on this business role?
Having spent time again working with non-lawyers, you understand there's different things that matter rather than just the legality of something. So the cost, the relationship. So as I'm sure you've experienced with a contract, you may have certain rights under a contract, but you waive them because you want to maintain the relationship and you're worried more about the long term than the short term of being right. Another thing that, I believe in training and getting better. And so when I was at Scott's Miracle Grow, they put several people through an executive coaching program. And it was a several-week program. You had a private coach. They took you through various books and worked on they did a 360, found out your weaknesses, and worked on developing you as a better leader. So when I was here, I think I'd been here about 5 years, and I mentioned to my boss, can I do that again? Just because I think a refresher of having somebody come in, do a 360, figure out where I can improve, and then focus on improving it. And we did that, and I may do it again in the future because it's such a great help, because you get blind spots. And sometimes the higher you move up, the less people are to tell you where you're screwing up, which is very frustrating because you can't get better if you don't know what you're doing wrong.
And the further you get away from the work that's being done on the ground, it becomes more difficult. When you're a sea level, whatever, people don't want to upset you. So they won't tell you, why things aren't working the way you think they should be working. And, just having that ability to, that's one of my blind spots is that I'm apparently, very forceful and intimidating. At least I don't think I am, but other people, have fed that back to me. And that prevented me from finding out why things weren't working. And so I think your things that you're given to work on may be entirely different than that. I hope they are, because that one's a hard one to overcome. If you think you're being friendly and you're coming off as, oh God, he's scary. But you really do have to. None of us are going to quite achieve perfection here, and to step back and look at yourself and understand where you're preventing the information you need from coming to you is super important.
It was interesting. One of the things I needed to work on was I did not think sort of extracurriculars were important. So United Way drives or working at the blood bank or getting everybody a Christmas dinner outing. Like, we come in, we do our work, we go home. And the team wanted more team building activities. They wanted more things that were beyond just work. And so I would have even never thought of that. But that was what came through the 360. So then you start having, okay, we're going to have more team lunches. We're going to do more team charity activities, team building activities. And people eat it up. They loved it. And I would have never known that had I not had a 360.
That's great. We have been going longer than you might realize, almost 50 minutes now. So let me, I'll turn it back to Josie to see if she's got any additional questions. But my closing question that I never tip off to you guys is, if you had to go back to, and maybe law school is too recent, but step back to what you worried about when you were, in your 20s. And if you go back and have a conversation with yourself, what would you say? Worry about more or worry about less?
Well, the one thing that I would tell myself in terms of my behavior is I probably should have spent more time exercising when I was at the large law firm, because I hardly did. It was all about billable hours. In at 7 a.m., out at 11 p.m., and running down your health. You've got to take the time. I still don't know when I would have fit it in, but that would be the advice, is figure out a way. Because there's a 10-year period there where I did not work out at all, and I'm sure I'm going to pay for it as I get older. Um, the other part of it is explaining to myself all those things I stressed about and worried about, they somehow work themselves out. As long as you don't do anything that's, illegal or immoral, bad things are going to happen. You're going to reach spots where you may not have work or have enough work, or you got to switch jobs. It all sort of comes together. And the key that makes it work is your network, the people you know, the relationships you build. Um, it's amazing. Guys I played on the rugby team with in law school are still close friends today, and issues come up, and they're the ones I reach out to for help, or they reach out to me for help from relationships built 20, 25 years ago.
Do you have anything else, Jesse?
I do have a question.
Okay.
Just from like other in-house counsel I've had the chance to speak to, I've noticed you all tend to work at a big firm or like as litigators first. And I was wondering if you guys see that as like an unofficial, I guess, mandatory training to do before in-house counsel, or if you see people go straight from in-house, or it's kind of like the benefit, I guess, of being at that big firm before going in-house.
I think there's a benefit from private practice. It doesn't necessarily have to be a big firm.
Mm-hmm.
Being in private practice where you get exposed to a lot of things and you do it more in depth. Because there's a lot of things you do in house you get exposure to, but you don't necessarily get into the nitty gritty as you do in private practice. And you've got to learn that nitty gritty. I had a person explain it to me once. Your career is kind of like an hourglass. When you start out as a new lawyer, you're doing anything that comes in the door to learn as much as you can. You hit about the 5-year point, you really need to specialize and get good at something. So you know how to get good at something, and you have something you can fall back on as your expertise. And then as you get closer to the 10, 15-year point, you need to spread back out again because you're in more of a leadership management role. You need to be able to handle multiple areas, delegate work down. And this applies whether you're in private practice or you're in-house. So it's hard to get that specialty if you go straight in-house, and that's where I think private practice experience helps.
Gotcha. Thank you.
I also think, when I was looking at hiring young lawyers, it would be pretty rare for me to not look for someone that had had some law firm experience or something similar to that. I think the only person I can think of off the top of my head that I hired that hadn't had any law firm experience had spent like 6 years at Accenture, which frankly was the same thing. It was a consulting services business instead of a law firm's name on the outside. And maybe that needs to change. Maybe the law firms are going to get tired of training our juniors for us. But I really think it is not only very useful, but practically mandatory. Because if you start your career in an in-house role, likely you're going to be in a very specialized role, and you're not going to get that opportunity to do the hourglass that you talked about. You're not going to get that broad exposure.
Exactly. And you only learn one way of doing it. And when you work for multiple clients, they all have multiple templates. They have multiple ideas of how they want things to happen, multiple issues. I actually found I did a lot of Chapter 11 debtor reorganization work. And that was the best preparation for in-house, because when you're trying to rebuild a bankrupt company, you see everything. There isn't an issue that doesn't come up. And so seeing how everything can go wrong and figure out how to fix it makes it very helpful when you get into a business and trying to keep things from going wrong.
There was a management consultant named Richard Farson who wrote in a book, it's great to learn from your own mistakes, but even better to learn from other people's.
I like that.
Okay. Anything else that we didn't cover that you think we should have covered?
No, I just appreciate the opportunity to do this, and I'm excited that the Corporate Law Center is getting out there more and that they have a person devoted to it in your new role, because it's a great organization. I went into the practice of law with the specific purpose of I wanted to help businesses, because most people make their daily life from working for a business and from the marketplace. And being able to expand the marketplace, have good, solid businesses out there helps everybody. It's just the side effects of good business are immense. And so I'm excited to see the focus on corporate law back at the University of Cincinnati.
With that advertisement, we're going to end it right there. Thank you so much for your time, Kasey. I really enjoyed it.
Likewise. Thank you.